Yeah. When it comes to this arena of biblical archaeology, there are two camps, the minimalist and the maximalist, and most archaeologists fall in the minimalist camp. Many do not believe that the Bible presents an accurate historical account, before, I think, King Ahab or King Omri. Why is this why is this the case? And is the sentiment beginning to change with all the discoveries that are being made?
I would say yes, not fast enough for my taste.
Hmm.
But I think there are things that are happening in the world of archaeology that are tending to confirm the biblical picture of things, and not the more the maximalist picture, not the minimalist picture of things. And but what's interesting, why do these people hold this view of the Bible? They didn't come to it by archaeology. They came to it by whatever Bible course they took, Bible is history, or
Mhm.
whatever Bible course they took in graduate school or in college. What was that? It was higher critical theory. It was 19th century higher critical theory, which grew up in a vacuum, had no archaeological foundation because archaeology didn't exist back then, and no Near Eastern studies, comparative
Mhm.
literature foundation because none of that existed to the point that it does today, 120, 30 years ago. So all of these concepts and ideas that the Bible couldn't have been written by Moses, that the phonemic Hebrew wasn't even existing yet. And so the whole Old Testament, including the Torah, has to be written between the 10th century BC and the 5th century BC. And that's what they learned. They
Mhm.
learned that the scholarly idea of the origin of the Old Testament is higher critical theory, which is based on ideas and even linguistic ideas and archaeological ideas that are no longer supportable with facts.
Mhm. Yeah.
They learned a false system. They learned to think about, but they think that's scholarship, and
Mhm.
so they learned to dismiss the Bible early on. They didn't have to deal with Bible history. And so when they started to study archaeology, and by the way, archaeology is about interpretation. All finds have to be interpreted. All evidences in archaeology have to be interpreted. And so, what do you think? If you're one of these scholars that doubts the historicity of the Bible, and you have three or four or five particular interpretations of a given archaeological event, discovery, scenario, and three of them support the Bible and two of them don't, or one of them supports the Bible and three of them don't, which one are you going to pick?
Mhm.
You're
Yeah.
always going to pick the one that's closest to your own belief system.
Mhm.
And I promise you, there for every discovery, there's always a viewpoint or an interpretation of that find or idea that is sort of a legitimate, 50-50 or even better possibility with the view that says it disagrees with the Bible. So which one are you going to pick? Well, I think it's more logical when I look at these things. It's more logical to say, well, that matches the Bible because that's what we're talking about, isn't it? The Bible gives us a very long history. There's a lot of history. It's true historiographical writing. Why wouldn't we pick the viewpoint of archaeology that is consistent with Scripture as opposed to another interpretation that might not be? Can I give you an example?
Yeah, absolutely.
Prior to the 1990s, nobody had ever seen any inscription that a King David actually
Right.
exists, right? Nobody.
Yeah.
So it was pretty easy for archaeologists to say, well, there's nothing in the extra biblical
Mhm.
discoveries that shows King David. So we ought to be able to just write King David off. He's a myth. He's a legend. Oh, there might have been such a guy. But as far as being a king and doing the things that he did as the Bible describes him, no. Um, and then all of a sudden, in Abraham Biran's excavations up at Tel Dan in the
Mhm.
late 90s, in a piece of a wall, it says in situ in the excavation itself, there's an ancient stela that was broken up in pieces and actually found in secondary use as rocks in the wall. in a wall. But they found these things and they began to put these pieces together. And what did they find on this stela? By the way, there are like 4 or 5 biblical personalities mentioned in this stela once they began to get more pieces of it. But there was one name that stood out,
Mm-hmm.
and that was Beit David, the house of David.
Yeah.
And for the first time in history, all of a sudden, you had a non-biblical, extra-biblical reference to the dynasty of King David. Well, if you have a Davidic dynasty, isn't it logical to assume that the head of the dynasty, the great ancestor, right, is
Mm-hmm.
David, a guy named David? And all of a sudden, David went from being a nobody to being a somebody
Yeah.
in history. Now, were there detractors? Yes. There were a few scholars that came along who just, out of the Copenhagen school mainly, who just couldn't stand this translation. They said, well, it could mean this, it could mean that, it could mean something else. They started coming up with all kinds of alternative ways of reading these letters. And now everybody just sort of chuckles at that because
Mm-hmm.
these were desperate attempts to throw all this stuff out and not confirm the Bible. But now everybody, there's nobody left in the world who doubts that's what this is.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you do doubt it, I mean, it's pretty obvious. You know, you look silly. To a point, you look, after a certain point, you look silly.
Yeah.
And so now, by the way, now not only do we have the Tel Dan inscription, the house of David, we have also seen it now in a couple of other places. It looks like, and most scholars agree, that it appears on the Moabite stone,
Oh.
the Moabite inscription,
Yeah.
the King Mesha inscription. That it also appears. Ken Kitchen thinks he has seen it very clearly in the inscriptions of Sheshonq the first, who's Shishak, biblical Shishak, who remember came in the time of
Yeah.
Rehoboam and did a bunch of temple stuff, and but that was the same guy, and it mentions the heights of David, the people who live in the heights of David.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Uh, so they even understood that the name of that whole Central Hill Country area in the southern Levant was belonging to this guy named David. And so anyway, it's just kind of interesting that all of a sudden, for a long time, we had nothing. And then things start popping up. Oh, it's there, it's there, it's there. And so these are the kinds of things that I think push our thinking away from minimalism more toward, well, wait a minute, maybe this really did happen. Maybe he's a real person. Maybe these things really did. I see nothing. So far, I see really nothing in scripture that can't be confirmed by archaeology, or archaeology says nothing against it.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Yeah.
let's face it, archaeology, we haven't uncovered everything. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe only a few percentage, a small percentage of the available archaeological sites in the Near East have even been touched by archaeologists. There are millions, we know, everybody knows there are millions and millions of
Mm-hmm.
writings and cuneiform tablets and all kinds of that are out there that we have never even seen. They're
Yeah.
still under the ground. We still haven't touched it. And so if you look back through history, one thing is really obvious. If you bet against the Bible at a given point, you probably are going to have egg on your face sometime down the line, either
Yeah.
in your lifetime or shortly thereafter, because almost everybody who has stacked their cards against the Bible and bet against the Bible has wound up having to admit, or maybe they still ignore it, but
Mm-hmm.
having to sit in the face of evidence that's being thrown at them from unearthing the Bible that, I guess these things actually do exist, or they did exist.
Yeah. Edwin Yamauchi in his book says we've really only tapped into about 10% of what is out there regarding
I think it's
archaeological
less.
discovery.
I
It's
think it's way
less.
less. Yeah.
Even now, still less.
Yeah. Less. It's like our site at Tal Amam.
Mm-hmm.
We excavated there 16 years.
Mm-hmm.
And we had 13,000 6 by 6 meter squares on our site grid. And in 16 years, we excavated into about 150 of them.
Wow.
Do the math.
Yeah.
I mean, every archaeological site you know about, even the great cities of Babylon, where they just uncovered massive stuff,
Mhm.
they only uncovered a very, very small percentage, a
Man.
very small fraction, 3, 4, 5%. There's so much more out there. But enough has been discovered to show that the Bible records what it touches on. When it touches in testable, checkable ancient Near Eastern
Mhm.
history, it's always right on. It's
Yeah.
always exactly right. And but of course, there are people out there who want to say, "Oh, the Book of Daniel, it wasn't really written, in the exile. It was written sometime in the Hellenistic period, or it was written even after that. And all these detailed prophecies had to be written after the fact." And there are people who will say that. But if you go back and really, really look at it, no, no. In fact, when I learned Aramaic, we learned good old Babylonian Aramaic. Aramaic became the lingua franca of the Babylonian Empire, Nebuchadnezzar, and all that.
Mm.
And if you want to learn good Babylonian Aramaic, where do you go? One of the first places you go is you start in the book of Daniel.
Mm.
That's
Yeah.
good old 6th century BC Babylonian Aramaic. Every linguist knows that. And so, if this were written much later in the Hellenistic period, how would they have such an affinity, for this good old Babylonian lingua franca?
Hmm.
It makes no sense when you really look at it closely. People will believe what they want to believe. When they
Hmm.
don't want to believe the Bible, they open themselves to. They're the ones that open themselves to myths. People that just refuse to believe the Bible is historical, they're the ones that invent myths and legends in order to make the Bible not be true. And but if you want to go with factual history, go with the Bible. But I would always say there's always this little caveat: rightly, rigorously interpreted. We need to go in and do some research on what these some of these ancient phrases and ancient concepts and ideas, what they actually mean back in the day.
All right. Well, Dr. Collins, one of the most significant discoveries, I think, is the city of Sodom, because, I came to Christ, in high school, my senior year, and every book or commentary I picked up back there in the early 80s was saying, this is a myth. The important things is is the lesson it teaches. Don't be bad. Treat people nicely. But otherwise, it's really mythology. And you made a remarkable discovery here at Tal El Hammam there. Tell us a little bit about it. First of all, how did you select the site of Tal El Hammam? And when did you start digging there?
It was just one of those things that happens to you that you don't really know at the time where it's going to go or if it's going to go anywhere at all.
Mm-hmm.
But I had back in the 1990s, I had taken a several tour groups, but one in particular down to the southern part of the Dead Sea, where a site called Baba Dra was the traditional
Right.
Sodom for a lot of people. And I took people down there, and the night before I did that on this one particular trip, I got the Bible out and was just kind of going to brush up on the Sodom story. So I read through it, and I got to the end of it and I thought, wait a minute, I don't see anything in that geography that would take us to the south end of the Dead Sea. And I read it again and again that same night, like three, I think 4 times. And I got to the end of all that and I thought, not only is there nothing in the text geographically to put Sodom at the south end of the Dead Sea, but everything in the text points it to the north and east of the Dead Sea. And so I was looking at that, and from that moment on, this was 1996, I think, and we were right in the middle of excavating the site of up at Kerben El Makadr in the West Bank. Didn't need a project. I mean, we're just starting on that one. And so I thought, well, if I ever run out of things to do, uh, run out of projects, I'm going to come back to this because it was bugging me sufficiently at that point where I need
Mm-hmm.
to do something about that. So in the year 2000, we had a season in 2000 up at Kerb at Elmcotter, and the Intifada got a little dicey. I mean, they're starting to throw rocks at the bus and things like that. It was not safe for us to excavate anymore up in the West Bank, and so uh, by that winter, I was thinking, no, wait a minute, what's an archaeologist going to do? We don't have a place to go. We need to be digging. And then I thought, oh, Sodom. So I decided I was going to attack that issue while I had some time. So I did. And I put in a paper to read at the Near East Archaeological Society that fall. And so I knew if I didn't do that, by the way, I wouldn't do the research. I find an excuse. Something else would come along and snatch it from me. And so I'd say, okay, I'm gonna put in to read a paper, and so I'll actually do it. And so I worked on it for a year. It got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And but I did present it that fall. And what was interesting about that, you mentioned Ed Yamauchi earlier. I remember when I got to the end of my presentation, because there were a bunch of people there. In fact, almost everybody in the room would have accepted Baba Dra in the South as Sodom.
Yeah.
They just would have. But there was one guy after I got through who was making his way up to me. I mean, he was just kind of going around people. I mean, that was Ed Yamauchi. He was coming from the
Mhm.
back of the room and he was headed toward me. And I'm thinking, oh, Ed's going to clobber me. You know, he's going to bring something out of left field that I didn't see. And he came up and he said, I totally agree with you.
Mm.
Oh, he said, that always bothered me. And I totally agree with you. And I felt real good. So if Ed
Yeah.
thought that, then I feel better. So, but then one thing, came to shove. But to shorten that whole story, it was the biblical geography, the very detailed geography of the location of Sodom embedded in Genesis 13.
Mm.
That was the primary passage that was written in Scripture to take us to the city of Sodom. And if you work through that geography, which I did very carefully, it took us north and east of the Dead Sea.
Mhm.
So essentially, what Scripture told us was that Sodom was the largest fortified urban center northeast of the Dead Sea, within the Kikar of the Jordan, the circular floodplain immediately north of the Dead Sea, where the Jordan River comes down and empties in to the north end of the Dead Sea. That's the Kikar of the Jordan. And so that's where Sodom would be located. So if it's the largest Bronze Age city in that area, how difficult would that be to find? Well,
Mhm.
it wasn't difficult,
Yeah.
because when we got on the ground in Jordan and looked at all the sites, there was one site that was magnificently larger, several orders of magnitude larger than all the other sites in the region. In fact, we now know it as the largest continuously occupied Bronze Age city in the entire southern Levant. And so there's nothing bigger and longer lasting in the Bronze Age than the great city of Tal el Hammam, which, by the way, um, if you Google that up, you'll see it's Tal el Hammam, Sodom. Google's
Mhm.
got it solidly labeled now as
Mhm.
Sodom. And so the worldview is changing on this, that that the biblical description of Sodom demands a location north and east of the Dead Sea. And of course, then we excavated. So anyway, I always said it like this, Pat. Um, it should be in the right place. It's got to be in the right place. Genesis 13 geography, the right time frame. That's time frame of Abraham, and it's got to have all the right stuff. And part of the right stuff was, how was Sodom destroyed? Genesis 19 says Sodom was destroyed by fire and burning stone, or burning stone and fire. Goprit, translated sulfur sometimes, or
Mhm.
brimstone. That's just one of the many meanings of this. Several times in the Old Testament, Goprit is translated lightning. But really, the base meaning is like burning stone. So burning stone and fire from out of the heavens. What does that sound like? Um, Sounds like meteoritic activity to me.
Mhm.
Sounds like an asteroid strike or a comet frag or something like that. And lo and behold, now at the end of toward the end of our excavations, the last 5 or 6 years, a whole team of of impact researchers, astrophysicists, geophysicists, a materials scientist, a whole big team of them, over 20 of them, began analyzing and studying samples from the Middle Bronze destruction layer. That's the time of Abraham, Middle Bronze Age. From the Middle Bronze destruction layer at Tal Hammam. And what have they proved? Now, two big scientific papers have been published. One in 2021 in Nature Scientific Reports, a very prestigious journal, and another one about less than a month ago now. The follow-on paper has been published, and they are ranking way up there. Some of the highest accessed scientific papers in the history of scientific papers. It's really amazing the readership we've gotten off this. But right stuff, a destruction by a meteoritic cosmic event. And that's exactly what the Bible describes. So anyway, here's what we've got now. Tal Hammam's in the right place. It's in the right time frame. It has the right destruction to be the city of Sodom. It has everything you need to be the city of Sodom. And it's just a given now. By the way, the southern site that everybody wants to make out to be Sodom was destroyed at least 500, if not 700 years before Abraham was ever born. I don't care where you date Abraham, early or late. Baba Dra was destroyed about 2500 BC. That's way too early for the time of Abraham. And everybody knows it, but they don't like to think about it sometimes.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So Tal Hammam is the right place. In fact, what was really exciting and a little bit weird last year, my wife and I like the show Jeopardy. You ever watch Jeopardy? And we're watching Jeopardy, and lo and behold, we get to Final Jeopardy. And what's the question on Final Jeopardy? A site in northern Jordan. They mentioned our site. Tal Hammam has been identified, destroyed by an airburst, blah, blah, blah. What biblical city do they think this is? You know, and of course, there we are. We even made Final Jeopardy. And by the way, only one of the three contestants got it right.
Yeah. Wow. Well, hey, tell us what you found at that destruction site. I mean, the destruction level. How far down did you have to go? I don't think people understand the layers you had to work through. And what did you find at that destruction site that convinces you this thing was destroyed? It was not burned down. Something else happened there.
Right. Well, over about 80% of the site, the destruction layer from the Middle Bronze Age, from the time of Abraham, is right on the surface. On the upper city, it's below about 3 or 4 meters, 10 feet or so of Iron Age debris, and because during the time of King David and Solomon, they built a store city up on top, and because it took about 700 years for the grain to start to be able to grow there in that area again. But anyway, from the time that city was destroyed, it took over 700 years for the soils in the area to recuperate to the point where they could grow grain once again. So this was a big devastation. It just wasn't a city. It was 400 square kilometers of a civilization there that was destroyed in the blink of an eye. But what we discovered, and by the way, when we say we discovered it in the Middle Bronze destruction layer, time of Abraham, and not in the strata above, this would be the upper city. The upper city, because on the lower city, there's no stratum above it. There's only strata below it, and because nobody ever built on the lower city over it. So this destruction layer across the entire site, upper city, lower city, wherever we excavate, is 1 meter to 1.5 meters deep. It's thick debris.
Yeah.
In that debris, everything is churned up. Pieces of bricks, pieces of plaster, pieces of animals, pottery, and pieces of people. And we called it I didn't name it this. One of our supervisors called it the Cuisinart effect. Right? It's like somebody took a city, threw it in a blender, and hit the button. That's what that destruction matrix looks like. It just churned up. But it's full of what we call airburst proxies. These are the kinds of things that are created by one of these explosive, catastrophic meteoritic airburst events that are only created by this kind of event, impact event. And we're talking about elements like high platinum spike, iridium, osmium, fractured quartz. By the way, fractured quartz grains are something really interesting because quartz fractures at a very, very high pressure rate.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you know what the pressure of your car tires are, right? 30, 33 psi. To create shocked quartz, to take a quartz grain and fracture it in the way that the quartz grains in this layer are, many of them are fractured. It's now estimated, and this is part of these scientific papers that have been written, it takes 750,000 pounds per square inch to create the fractured quartz that they're finding on the site. That's pressure.
Wow.
And we have pieces of pottery, the surfaces of which are melted superficially into a greenish glass. And underneath that melt, that surface melt, they have found for example, zirconia, the mineral zirconia, crystals of zirconia that were not only melted, in other words, they weren't angular. When you put them under an electron microscope, a big scanning electron microscope, they should be normal, angular, but they're not. They're like bubbles. They're melted. What does it take to melt a zircon? About 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. What does it take to boil zircon? We actually found zircons with little bubbles in them. They're starting to off gas. They're starting to boil. And what's it take to boil a zircon? Almost 8,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're talking about temperatures that are just, whoa. By the way, by comparison, flowing volcanic magma is about 1,800 to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The hottest temperatures that are able to be created terrestrially by natural means are cool compared to the temperatures and the temperature indicators of high heat on Tal el-Hammam. We're talking about thousands of degrees, not just a couple thousand degrees.
Yeah.
And so the indicators are across the entire site. They are churned into the layers, but they're not rare. In fact, we found the first high heat indicator melted pottery sherd we found on the site happened in the first little 2 by 2 meter probe that we did into the Middle Bronze destruction matrix. Remember, there are 13,000 6 by 6 meter squares across this vast site. In the very first penetration we made into the Middle Bronze destruction layer, we began to find these high heat melt products. What does that tell you? We didn't hit a needle in a haystack. We hit a fairly common phenomenon, and that was that all kinds of materials, mud bricks. We found melted bricks, plasters, not just pottery. So, and of course, they had to be in exactly the right place, like on the roof, exactly the maximal exposure, because this explosive event happens like that.
Yeah.
It happens in a fraction of a second. So everything is going to be sheared off, pulverized, destroyed. And we find, by the way, silica microspherules, little tiny, you can't even see them with the naked eye. This tiny spherules of iron and silica and other things. These are the kinds of things that happen with airburst events. So in the Tal el-Hammam destruction layer, we have now over 20, I think the count is, the first paper was 21, now it's up to over 25 proxies, specific phenomena that only occur with airburst impact events are found in the destruction layer at Tal el-Hammam. There's no doubt now that Tal el-Hammam, Sodom, was destroyed by a fiery cataclysm that came out of the heavens. There's no doubt about that. That's a scientific fact.
Yeah. Wow. And what about Lot's wife here? Did you find the pillar of salt there? Did you find her?
Well, if you would have asked asked me that question maybe 10 or 15 years ago,
Mhm.
even while we were excavating, I didn't have a really good answer to that question. Of course I'd thought about it because every time, you talk to somebody about it, they ask you the question, what about
Right.
Lot's wife? Um, and I didn't know. I don't know. We were looking at everything. I mean, we even found an Arabic idiom from like the Middle Ages
Mm.
uh, that the word pillar of salt, phrase pillar of salt, was a reference to some kind of cancer. Um, I mean, we were all over the map and trying to see what in the world this language actually meant. But what's interesting is we now know that this explosive airburst event, where you have a meteoritic object coming in at a very shallow angle and coming through the atmosphere, it's going to go from solid to liquid to gas to plasma in a very short period of time, in a matter of less than a second. And when that happens, it's a huge explosion. The temperatures are off the charts. They're like nuclear explosion kind of temperatures. And by the way, we're not saying this is a bomb, right?
Mhm.
It's not ancient aliens or anything like
Yeah.
that. But what we are saying is that this explosive kind of event creates a an event that has certain proxies, these little results that can only happen with these events, and we've got a bunch of those. And what happened? One of those proxies, and I didn't mention this one. One of those proxies in that destruction layer is a high level of Dead Sea salt,
Mhm.
because we know that it came in shallow, exploded, went to critical mass over the north end of the Dead Sea. It's the only way to explain the salt. And so when that thing exploded, and as it's coming in, it pushed vast quantities of vaporized Dead Sea water and vaporized salt up over the landscape, which became part of the permanent matrix of the destruction at Tal Hammam. In the destruction layer of the time of Abraham at Tal Hammam, there is a 6 times more concentration of Dead Sea salt than there is in the Dead Sea water.
Mm.
How did that get so salty? Well, it got salty probably because of this event that just pushed this up over the landscape and just seeded the landscape with all of this vaporized salt. What's interesting about that is if Lot's wife had gone south towards Zoar, which she did, the Bible tells us she had headed south towards Zoar, which is down toward the southern end of the Dead Sea, or about actually around the Wadi Mujib, which is maybe about a half a day, 3/4 of a day ride on a donkey. She stopped and turned back. We don't know if she was walking back or she just turned back and looked. But obviously she stopped on the margin of the blast zone. Had she been in the blast zone, she'd have been vaporized.
Mm.
But she was evidently far enough on the margin where what happens is that as that salt was pushed up over the landscape, the whole landscape, including her, was covered with salt.
Mm.
And it instantly, of course, hardened as a crust over the whole landscape, including her. Well, obviously, she's just she was covered with it, and it just encrusted her. She didn't even have time to fall down, um, because there was enough heat where the the water just vaporized out, and
Mm.
this salt just went from being vaporized to being solid again in very quick uh, kind of interval. So that we think that's what happened to her. She became a pillar of salt. Now we all know that Dead Sea salt is highly water soluble. So
Mhm.
in a few rainy seasons, she would have melted away.
Oh, yeah.
So when somebody takes you to the Holy Land and say, "Oh, see that little spire up there? That's Lot's wife."
Yeah.
Don't believe it, because there's lots of them. In fact, there's one that has several spires. It's like Lot and his daughter and his dog. It's you know
Yeah.